I have, yes, yes.
Hi everyone. Really happy to be live with Olga today. Do you want to start us off with an intro to you and your books, please?
I will. These aren't traditional crime novels because they're comic crime. And I have a heroine who is 50 something. That's absolutely deliberate because, as those of us who have hit 50 and over know, all women over 50 are invisible. So my heroine is determined that she will not be invisible. She went to the Marcia Blaine School for Girls, which some of you may remember was the school that appeared in The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie, written by Muriel Spark. And she's had the finest education in the world. She now works in Morningside Library, where she stops people getting copies of The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie because she thinks it's brought her school into disrepute. But Marcia Blaine, who founded the school, and we think must be several hundred years old, keeps turning up in Morningside Library and sends her on missions to far-flung places. And as I say, she's had the finest education in the world. She speaks all languages. She can do martial arts. She sings. She plays musical instruments. But she is actually a complete idiot. And she generally misunderstands what it is she's supposed to be doing in her missions. And she tends to, I was going to say she tends to complete her missions. I was going to say her missions tend to be completed without her doing anything.
Yeah, or by luck a little bit, aren't they?
Yes, yes.
We're actually live on Muriel Spark's birthday.
I know, it's fantastic. I've just been out with the Muriel Spark Society. We always have a birthday lunch on the Saturday closest to her birthday. So it's wonderful that this is her birthday.
I
didn't get to see her.
You didn't get to see what?
Sorry, I was going to say she came to the Edinburgh Festival a number of years ago, and I didn't get to see her. But apparently, somebody at the end, when she was having the questions, somebody at the end said, "Do you find your characters taking over?" And she just looked at them and said, "How could that happen?" So a woman very definitely in charge of her characters. Her characters never took her over.
Well, very definitely in charge, yes. I was going to say, I think Shona and Miss Blaine would approve of me because I've never actually read The Crime of Miss Jean Brodie.
Well, that is indeed, that's admirable. Well done. Although it is actually, I shouldn't be saying this, but it is actually a very good book. And it's quite short as well.
How do you choose? So you've sent her to some really interesting places. She's been to Russia. I've not read the newest book yet, Full Confessions, but I've read the rest of the series. So she's been to Russia. She's been to like a kind of vampiric France and the era of Macbeth. How do you choose those eras to send her to?
Well, I hadn't actually thought about this, but somebody asked me that recently, and I've realized that I'm sending her to places or eras that I've got an affection for. And then I feel that that legitimizes my making fun of them because I do actually love them. So I studied Russian, and I've read a fair amount of Russian literature, and I love particularly Tolstoy, writing about the 19th century. So I set it there because I was trying to riff on the things that he wrote. For example, before I started, I knew I wanted 3 scenes. I wanted a grand ball. You have to have a lovely ballroom with people dancing. I knew that I wanted a duel in the forest with somebody getting shot. And I knew that I wanted, because of Anna Karenina, I wanted a scene on a train. So those were the 3 things that I knew I was doing. And then with the second one, I actually spent a year in France working as an assistant in a school. And despite my name, I am Scottish. And Scotland had the old alliance with France, and it had Mary Queen of Scots, who was brought up in France. And I went to France thinking, this is my spiritual home. Discovered nobody in France has heard of Scotland. Nobody knows anything about it. Nobody knows about the Olga lions. And I had to go to the police to get a residence permit and a work permit. And eventually I was getting this set up, and they were writing the form out, and they wrote my address, and they wrote Angleterre. And I said, excusez-moi, I said, ce n'est pas Angleterre, c'est Écosse. And they looked at me in French bewilderment. I said, no, I said, it's Scotland, it's not England. You have to put down Scotland for my country of residence. And in the end, they put down Écosse, but they put it in inverted commas. Clearly they thought I just made up this word, and put it in. And the third one, when I was at school, this is something that I suspect other Scottish pupils will know. We had to do Macbeth for our hires, which is the equivalent of the English A levels. So I knew the play very well, and that was why I decided to do that. And this latest one is it's set in Venice, and that's partly because when I was a student, I went with a friend. We went in an Interrail ticket to Italy. And we just couldn't believe it. When we got off the train in Venice, you get off the train, you come out of the railway station, and there's all this water. And it was just such an extraordinary thing. It was just remarkable. So I felt very warm towards Venice, and that was why it was the fourth one.
Lovely. We've got some hellos. So we've got Leslie said hello. So is Donna. Patsy's here. And Karen said hello as well.
Lovely. Patsy is wonderful.
Patsy, she's just a legend, isn't she?
Totally.
She's like walking sunshine, I think, Patsy.
That is the best description. Yeah, definitely. Yes.
And the person who got me into your novels.
Is that right? Well, the check had better be in the post then.
Never send out a book recommendation from Patsy. She gives you like cracking ones.
And that's so good of her, because as I say, my books are absolutely not traditional. Actually, when I wrote the first one, I am a journalist to trade. And because of that, I watch news bulletins the whole time. And I'm one of the dinosaurs that still reads newspapers. And I was just getting incredibly depressed and this, I have to say, was back in 2014. I didn't realize then that 2014 would be a golden age compared to now. But I was just so depressed by the news. And I found that was actually affecting me when I started reading books, because if there was jeopardy in books and terrible things happening, I was getting agitated because I was just feeling, I don't like this. I want something without any pressure and without any stress. So I decided to write this book, which was intended to be an escapist romp. It was basically just going to be funny, and people could read it without having to worry that something terrible would happen. And the next thing I knew, I was just thrilled to be taken up by Saraband to publish it. But the next thing I knew, it was being marketed as a crime novel. And I thought, good grief, this is very strange, because I didn't know I'd written a crime novel. And I very delicately mentioned this to the publisher, because you don't want to start arguing with a publisher and saying you've made a terrible mistake. But I said, I didn't really intend this to be a crime novel. And she said, you do know there are 6 murders in it. And I thought, oh, well, maybe you've got a point. So, but there's 6 murders that people don't need to worry about. So that's all right.
But, I mean, there is a space in crime for kind of things to be a bit different. I mean, people love urban fantasy with like wizards solving crime, and, cozy crime's a thing. And so why can't we have a time traveling comedic kind of crime? Like, there's a place for it in crime fiction.
I think that's true. And I don't know if you or anybody else has read Simon Brett's series called Blotto and Twinks, but they're basically comic crime. It must be set in, not entirely sure, I'd say probably the 1920s. And it's these 2 aristocrats and of course, aristocrats always have weird names. So although they've got proper names, it's a sister and brother. The sister is called Twinks and the brother is called Blotto. And they basically go around solving crimes together. And they're very funny. So, yeah, I think you're right that there is the space for it.
So with some of them, like the one I've just read that has Macbeth in, which is absolutely hilarious. By the way, I love that one. You obviously are just riffling off the story a lot, like Birnam Wood is kind of moving around and things. But how much with the others, where there is like a proper kind of era and things that they're set in, how much research do you have to go into for those?
I did a huge amount of research for the first one, which was the Russian one, and I had notebooks and notebooks full of notes, and I was going to the library and I was reading books, and the only problem was I then started trying to shoehorn in the information I had, and then realized that this was just completely boring and irrelevant. And all it was doing was sort of saying, you know, "Whoa, look, I've done the research, I know about this." So I've written about things that I know a bit about, and I've got a sort of magpie mind that I gather all sorts of ridiculous trivia in my head. So I was able to sort of get that up. I mean, but I did some research, but not over much, because I'm figuring they are comedies. I certainly try not to do anything that's completely inaccurate. But I also do push the boundaries for comedy reasons. But I mean, there was one thing I discovered when I was doing the second one, which was set in France in the year 1900. And I had no idea that the painter Toulouse-Lautrec was a wonderful cook. He loved cooking and he invented chocolate mousse. Now, who knew? I mean, so there are things like that that I put in, and what I like doing is putting in a mixture of things that I've completely made up and putting in wacky facts that are actually true, because I'm sure people think I just made up that Toulouse-Lautrec invented chocolate mousse, but he actually did. So I like sort of playing around like that and having a mixture of fact and fantasy.
Excellent. Patsy is saying something. She was going to say to you that her sister loved Venice, Fiona, and she always mentioned a storm where the St. Mark's Square got flooded.
Yes. I've never actually been in St. Mark's Square when it was flooded, but I mean, that seems to happen quite regularly. It must be such an extraordinary experience. You know, the whole concept of Venice is just bizarre, and I mean, it's basically it's all built up on sort of piles of wood in the water. I mean, these buildings don't have foundations, and then you're in this massive marble church and thinking, why is this not just going to sink into a canal, taking me with it? I mean, it's just an utterly bizarre place.
Isn't some of Venice actually sinking though?
Yes, and there have been things in the past where I don't know if there probably is still a fund which is trying to save Venice from sinking, because you know it's one of the UNESCO World Heritage sites. But there were scandals quite a few years ago that people had been raising money to help Venice, and this money was just being diverted and not actually getting to help Venice to stop sinking. But yeah, I mean, I think the feeling is that at some point it will go. And another thing that they're very worried about, and I don't know whether they're going to stop, is these enormous cruise liners, you know, that have maybe 5,000 people on them. They've been coming and berthing next to Venice, and they've been feeling that this isn't helping either with the number of people coming off, but the fact that, you know, these things are creating waves. So I think they may be cutting back on the number of cruise liners turning up.
All those cruise liners, when you go near them, are like huge, aren't they?
They're just mega. I was once speaking to somebody who was on one of these, and she said that, you know, they go off on day trips, but she said the one she was on was so big that some people didn't get off the cruise ship until 1 o'clock in the afternoon because it was taking so long to get people off. And you think, well, what's the point, really? It just sounds a bit grim.
I think so. I'm not sure I would want to go on a cruise though. They seem like floating incubators of diseases.
Yeah, there's a cruise line. I don't know. No, I was going to say I don't think it's Scottish. It's Norwegian, I think, called Fred Olsen. But they have Scottish names for their ships, and one of their ships was called the Black Watch, and everybody called it the Black Death because everybody got norovirus on it. So,
this book is set in. I was reading the description of it earlier. It's set in the pandemic or a pandemic.
It's set in a pandemic, and that, of course, was largely because we had gone through the pandemic. Venice was very badly affected by I mean, we're talking about the plague here. And what I loved in Venice was you had the doctors with the big beaks, the doctors in the plague outfits, which were sort of hats, and then they had sort of glass goggles, and then they had the beaks, and the beaks were supposed to stop them inhaling poisons and therefore getting infected themselves. So this is set in the 1630s, and it's based. No, it's not. It's set in 1650. Their last plague was in 1630, and Shona turns up to find herself dressed as a plague doctor. She's wearing the full gear, the full PPE.
Plus her trusty DMs.
Well, this time not. She's very upset to find that she is not wearing her trusty DMs, and because she always wears her trusty DMs, which are very useful for getting around, and she's upset to find that she has just is wearing these small leather slippers. And this may be a spoiler, but I'll tell you anyway, which is that she discovers that when she falls into a canal, this is actually quite helpful, because if she had her trusty DM, she figures she would just have been dragged to the bottom of the canal. So she figures that she's been looked after and having these little leather slippers, which aren't heavy enough to be a problem.
I feel like she was magically looked after in the book where she meets Macbeth by finding tea.
Yes, yes. She doesn't get paid for these missions, but Miss Blaine has told her that she'll give her reasonable expenses and that, she'll be looked after in terms of accommodation and so on. And she usually has something with her, like a handbag or a pouch, and she finds useful things turn up in this handbag or pouch that are useful to her mission or keeping her going, like tea. Because she does like a wee cup of tea. And bourbon. Yes, yes. Having said that, I don't think she's ever looked in her bag and found bourbon biscuits in them. I think she's only ever found tea. She keeps a stash of bourbon biscuits in the library, though. She has them.
It's a good plan. Solid plan. Keeping a stash of biscuits and some kind of beverage.
Yes, she's very particular about her tea. What she has is a mixture of Earl Grey and Darjeeling. And the reason I've got that, I actually nicked that from a friend of mine. And she's got obviously very good taste buds. So she always has tea that's a mixture of Earl Grey and Darjeeling. And she had some builders in, and she gave them this tea, and they were really upset. They wanted builder's tea. They did not want a mixture of Earl Grey and Darjeeling.
Yeah, I think people who drink tea seem to be the most set on their particular kind, yes. Don't they?
And also you see things periodically, charts with the different colours of how brown your tea can go. And again, people are, they always think that their level is absolutely right and everybody with a different level is completely wrong.
Yeah, see, I miss out on this. I'm a coffee girl only.
Right. And do you find you can drink coffee throughout the day, or do you have to stop at some point?
So I'm a teacher, which I think gives you an incredible power of immunity to caffeine.
Yes. I find if I take coffee in the evening, I just go completely hyper and can't sleep.
No, I've been known to take a cup of coffee to bed with me.
Yes, you are clearly a professional.
Too much, yeah, too much. Where is Shona going next? Have you got a sort of series of like an idea of how many more adventures she's going to go on?
I don't know, but I do have. I'm beginning to write the next one, and I don't think I'll tell you where it is yet. But what I can tell you is that it's at the seaside, and you know the seaweed called bladderwrack that's got little poppy bits in it. It's got sort of round bits. There was a bit of information I needed, and I thought I'll go on to Google and I'll Google about this. So I Googled, can you strangle somebody with bladderwrack? And immediately an answer came back saying, it is a crime to strangle people. And I now think the police are going to be round any moment. I'm probably going to be taken away when they start looking at my search history. I shall be removed.
There's probably an author in the group who would have tried it.
Yes, right. Well, we do have Portobello Beach in Edinburgh, so I could go off and find some bladderwrack and then find somebody to try and strangle with it and see what happens.
Or just like put it around a post and pull it.
Yes.
See if that would work.
Yes, I think that's a very good idea.
So yeah, that's all you're going to give away. You don't have any other like historical kind of periods or like countries that you're particularly like drawn to that you'd want to
I'm thinking at one point I haven't had anything that's actually set in Edinburgh, and there's a wonderful period at the end of the 18th century where there was a splendid hanging judge called Lord Braxfield, who was an absolute thug. And there was one time somebody was defending themselves and was obviously, well, I suspect you can argue that they were innocent. They were certainly putting up a very good case, and they were defending themselves very well. And at the end of this, Lord Braxfield said, I'll translate from the Scots. He said, "Yes, you're a very clever man, but you'll be none the worse of a hanging," he said, and got him sent away and hanged. And I thought Shona really must meet him, because Shona, as you've probably seen, Shona does law as a sort of, because she can do anything, she does law as a sort of side hobby, so she knows a lot about the law. And I thought that would be good to have her arguing with a hanging judge. And
she would argue with a hanging judge.
Yeah. I mean, she never holds back. She's very get up and go. She doesn't let things go.
Yeah, she doesn't always get the right end of the stick, but she'll definitely have a go at everything.
Yes, that is the unfortunate thing. And she has such a positive outlook that when things are going wrong, she generally tends not to realize things are going wrong. Indeed, even when she falls into a canal, she's okay about it.
I quite like her knack. So obviously she hides the crime of Miss Jean Brodie, but there are other times when she has to add like a little note to books, or
yes, or find other books that should be hidden as well. Yes, because yeah, she's not a very good librarian, I think. I don't know how the library would take to this, a librarian that goes around hiding books and not letting readers read them.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know how a librarian would feel about censoring people's access to books.
But she does feel she's doing it for the right reasons, that this is just, this book is so bad about her school. Yes, the reason for that, if I can sort of backtrack slightly, Muriel Spark wrote the book about her school. I mean, she called it the Marcia Blaine School for Girls, but it was actually a school in Edinburgh called James Gillespie's. And she wrote it about her teacher. And I don't know if you've seen have you seen the film of the Prime Minister Jean Brodie? Basically, it's this woman who, she really has control over her pupils, and she tries to sort of groom them so that they will live in the way that she has decided. And she's a seriously dodgy character who she loves. This is set in the 1930s, and she loves Mussolini in the black shirt. She's an absolute fascist. And this was based on Muriel Spark's own teacher, who loved Mussolini and the black shirts, and also called all of her pupils the creme de la creme. So when this book came out, the school was horrified because they still had people there who had taught with this woman, who was obviously the model for the book. Muriel Spark actually called her a character in search of an author. So the school was really, really upset by this. So this is where that came from. But I have to say that now the school can't get enough of Muriel Spark and has a Spark building and a Brody's cafeteria and so on. So they like capitalizing on the link now, but they didn't to begin with.
But I guess if it's like close to the time, you know, they remembered the teacher and things, that it would be that you can see them not liking that.
Absolutely, yes, because I mean, it was very obviously someone that they knew. And I think the teacher, I think her teacher taught until into the 1940s. So, you know, was still, as you say, there were people there who had talked with her, who knew her, and basically thought this was a terrible thing that Muriel Spark had done.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's probably good to sort of draw attention to terrible teaching if people are sort of going around promoting.
Well, I think the teacher sort of didn't do some of the things that were in the book, because in the book she's having affairs as well and so on. I don't think there was any question of this, and I also don't know that she was sort of grooming the kids in a particularly political way, but it was felt that, you know, her memory would be blackened. And that, I think that's an interesting question for writers. If writers are basing a character on a real person, how far can you go, especially if this person could actually be identified? And I mean, quite often you do get disclaimers saying these characters have no basis in reality, you know, living or dead. And presumably that's so that the publisher and the writer are covering themselves and not getting sued.
Yeah, it must be I see where you're going with that. How do you find it though? Because you're not afraid of playing with real fictional people.
I've fortunately done people who were either, if they were real, they're long dead, and if they're fiction, hopefully I can get away with it. And then, but it's just, I think my characters are generally so fantastical. They're not real life characters. Everybody, they're like sort of cartoon figures. Everything is magnified, that I hope I can get away with it. But I've done other writing. I actually write a series of cozy crime e-novellas under an assumed name, and with that they are very true to life, and I have to be careful not to base them on people I know, just in case I get this wrong.
Well, we're on those. Tell us about those. Tell us a little bit more about your ones under an assumed name.
Well, these are, this is a series that was commissioned. Basically, when I was looking for a publisher for the Miss Blaine's Prefect series, I don't have an agent, so I was just going out myself and I was sending things to publishers. And a friend had a connection with this firm in Germany who take books in English and they publish them as ebooks in English, but they also then translate them and get them published in Germany. So the first Miss Blaine's book was sent to this German publisher, and they turned around and said, "This is too zany for the Germans." And I frankly thought we should have that on the cover. I thought it should say "too zany for the Germans." And, you know, I'd read a book that said that. But they still said they liked my style, and they said they had a concept and they were looking for somebody to write it. And as I say, I'm a journalist, so that's something I can do. So I sent off some sample chapters, and what they wanted was a series that was set in the Cotswolds. It's sort of Midsummer Murders Light. So they wanted this series. And so I produced the first book, and they were about to publish it. And they suddenly turned around and they said, Olga Wojtas? That's not an English name. And I said, no, you're right. That's not an English name. And they said, but you have to have an English name because it's quintessentially English. It's in a little Cotswolds village, and it's got a village pub, and there's a tea room that has cream teas and so on. So they thought it was just weird if you had a weird foreign name attached to this. So my middle name is Helena, and I grew up in a street in Edinburgh called Marchmont Road. So I'm now Helena Marchmont, who I think sounds terribly posh. And the real excitement with that is that they decided to do an audio version of them, and I do an audio version of an audible version of the Miss Blaine's Prefect books, but that's fair enough because they're all in the voice of Shona, which is effectively my voice, a sort of Scottish Edinburgh voice. But there's no way I could have done anything with a series set in the Cotswolds. And the next thing I knew, they had commissioned Nathaniel Parker, Inspector Linley, to do the audio version. And he's got the most beautiful voice in the world. And I asked them if I could send him an email to say, I was just so amazed by this and it was fantastic. And they said, well, these were my editors. And they said, well, you can send an email to us and we will send it to our marketing department, and our marketing department will send it to Mr. Parker's personal assistant. And if the personal assistant thinks it's appropriate, they'll forward it to Mr. Parker. And I thought, this is never going to reach him. But anyway, I wrote a complete sort of fangirl email going, this is wonderful. I love it so much. This is terrific. 2 days later, I got back an email signed Love Nat. So me and Nat are like that. So there you go. But he just reads them so well. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people now seem to be going to audiobooks, which I must admit I don't do. I only ever read books. I don't listen to books.
No, I don't listen to books either, but I know people do enjoy them. I can't sit still long enough to sit in the
and if you were listening while you were doing something else, then you wouldn't be listening. So I don't, maybe on a car journey, I don't know, but I mean, I've never got into that, but I do know a lot of people really like audiobooks, and anything that gets people reading or listening to a book, I think is brilliant.
And they can be done, especially if you get someone with a really good voice. Patsy's telling me off on the stream that I should have watched Crime of Miss Jean Brodie.
It is actually a very good film. It's Maggie Smith, who is excellent. It's a good film. But it's interesting because it's Jean Brodie, as portrayed by Maggie Smith, wears very bright colours and everything else is quite drab. And her house has got a big red front door, and Edinburgh looks absolutely gorgeous with blue skies. And Muriel Smart didn't like it because she said this was set in the 1930s. And she said in the 1930s, everything was covered in smoke because people, they had coal fires. And of course, in Edinburgh, we had steam trains coming into the centre of the city, and everything was just covered in this sort of smoky mist.
Makes sense. So yeah, she'd prefer. Not many authors do overly like adaptations of their books and films, or do they?
I think that's right. Yes, I think with J.K. Rowling, she actually had a contract or a deal that she was involved in the production, so she was able to say, this is not how I imagine it. But you do get some things that when they turn into a film, they're just completely taken over and turn into something quite different from the film, from the book. But I suppose the authors just cry all the way to the bank, so that's all right.
The only author I don't know, but the only author I've read about that thinks the film version was as good, if not better, is the guy who wrote Fight Club.
Oh, right. That's interesting.
And he's
Yes.
quite open that he thinks some of the things they did in the film were better than his original story.
Gosh, right. And there's a book by the Scottish, I could think I can class him as a Scottish author, Michel Faber, who wrote this absolutely brilliant sort of sci-fi book set in the present called Under the Skin. And it was turned into a film starring Scarlett Johansson, and it bore no relation to the book whatsoever. It was completely different, and it was just wacky and strange and so on. And he thought it was wonderful. And I was very surprised by that, because I would have thought he would say, this has nothing to do with my book. And you've done something different. But maybe in a way, because it was so different, it wasn't actually undermining his book.
Yeah, maybe. I love that you're sporting a UK Crime Book Club badge.
I am sporting a UK Crime Book Club badge, which was very kindly sent to me by you. So I am wearing it with pride. It is a wonderful badge. I love the Crime Book Club branding. I think it's so good.
It's accidental. I think these ones aren't. Like the ones on the mugs and stuff were actually made for us. But the original branding that's on the group thing is just a bit of luck.
It's just brilliant. And it's, it is, I think it's such a good group. And as you say, crime fiction encompasses such a broad range. You can't say it's one particular thing. So I think whatever people's tastes are, there's always something for them.
I quite like the zany or wild edges of crime fiction, though.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that's why I'm such a big fan of Shona.
Right. How are you with Blood and Guts?
Fine, but I would prefer cozy crime, I think. Why?
I can't deal with Blood and Guts at all. And I also can't deal with it on screen either. Just have to close my eyes and so on. So I prefer things. That's part of this sort of getting agitated by things. So I don't like sort of explicit violence and things, because that just alarms me.
I'm a biologist as a specialist. Well, I did genetics as a specialism. But yeah, I'm fairly fine with a bit of blood and guts. Pretty strong stomach for gross things.
I didn't get much further than Spirogyra, so that's about it. Although we did at one point have to dissect an ox eye, which Shona actually mentions in various things, that she once had to do this and she didn't like it.
Eyes are a bit squishy. We were talking about this at school the other day. Eyes are the one thing that are a bit grim. But
I keep finding people who had to cut up frogs, and I never got as far as that. I was kicked out of the class before we got onto that, so that was a great relief.
We dissected a mouse when I was at uni.
Oh, that's particularly upsetting, because in the third book, as you know, Shona turns into a mouse, so she won't be at all happy to know about that.
No, and then meets a cat.
Yes, exactly, which is very worrying. Yes, when you're a mouse, it's not good meeting a cat. Yes.
But he's a friendly cat.
Yes. She's found she's able to talk to him, so that's fine. Yes. A cat with many different names.
Yeah.
Yes, because he's a cat that, like many cats, he belongs to two households, and each household thinks that he belongs to them. So he belongs to Lady Macbeth, who calls him Spot, and he belongs to the three witches, who call him Hemlock. And then he tells Shona that his real name is Frank. So, yeah, a lot of different names. But I think you tend to find cats who live in different households, and everybody thinks they belong to them, and they belong to about 3 different people, all of whom are feeding the cat.
yeah, it's a very cat-like thing, isn't it? What I really like about all of the books is that everyone you think, oh, you know, they're all so good that you think, oh, this, I don't know how the next one is going to be better than the first one. But they're all like, they've got so many layers of quite clever, witty jokes in them that are based on like where she is at the time and what's happening. That they're just, I don't know, they're marvelous. I think they're wonderful.
Well, it's so kind of you. I'm having a complete crisis of confidence with this one that I'm writing at the moment. I don't know whether everybody goes through that, but I'm sitting there thinking, this is trash, this is awful, and sort of, why am I bothering, and deleting bits and so on. But again, being a journalist, I don't do anything unless I'm up against a deadline. And I am now up against a deadline, so I think I'll have to produce it, trash or otherwise. It will have to be done.
It won't be trash.
Well, thank you for your faith. And it will involve someone possibly getting strangled with bladderwrack. So,
looking forward to it. I mean, it's an unusual way of killing people, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. Yes. Well, I've got a friend who's a scientist, and when I explained that I had this message saying it's a crime to strangle people, she said, well, you could work it out if you found out what the tensile strength of bladderwrack was. So I then Googled, what is the tensile strength of bladderwrack? And it turns out nobody has researched this. So that's something missing in society today. I think we should get a university onto it immediately.
There probably is a university that would love to do that.
Just have to sort that out.
This is Patsy. She says she's going to a post-mortem thing in Edinburgh in October, Olga, and they're dissecting the body.
Right. Okay. I used to, when I was on my previous newspaper, it was a thing called the Times Higher Education Supplement, and we had various specialisms, and I was the Scottish editor of it. But people were given particular subjects to look after. And at one point, I was looking after medicine. And the editor suggested that it might be good if I went and sat in on a post-mortem and saw what that was like, what the students were being taught. And I very carefully managed to avoid that. I don't think I could have coped. I would have been definitely one of the ones that just fainted the minute it started.
You know, I think it was interesting, but I've not been to one. There is a really cool art exhibition of someone who like plasticizes bodies.
Oh yes, the Gunther, I've forgotten his name. Yes, the German guy with the hat. Yes.
And I've been to that, and that was like really interesting.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yes, I think, you know, what he was doing was extraordinary. I still don't know I would have been able to cope with that either. But it's interesting, I was talking to a sort of alternative medicine person who does a thing, he's got an alarming name, but it's very good, called Heller work. And what she was saying was that round all our muscles is this white substance, which is the fascia. And that's actually what's keeping everything together. But surgeons always just used to scrape this away. And she was saying this stuff is absolutely crucial. And we're only now realizing that it is crucial because they thought it was sort of muck that they had to get rid of before they got onto the muscles and the bones. But the fascia are actually sort of running all the way through us and sort of, I don't know what they're doing. As I say, I got kicked out of my biology classes after Spirogyra, so I don't know how it all works.
We're working on the time supplements. Fascinating. That was
interesting. I was on the sister paper to the educational supplement was schools, and I was the higher education, which was colleges and universities. But I was the only one in Scotland, but everybody else was down in London, and they shared offices. So yeah, a lot of interesting things going on in education. Although I think the teachers are mainly interested in the job adverts. It doesn't matter what we're actually writing about. They're just looking for nicer jobs.
Well, it's the only way you can find on most teaching jobs, the time supplement.
Yes, yes.
But unless you just look into a place.
Mm. I mean, teaching is, I think, I won't say the most crucial profession, but certainly one of the most crucial professions. And I think particularly now that we've had the hassle of the pandemic, I think teachers have got so much to do in getting pupils up to speed with things.
I'm laughing because my husband tells me off because I heckle teaching adverts and tell people not to do it.
My mother was a teacher, and she would come home from work every day and say, "Promise me something that you'll never go into teaching." I think it was more she thought I would be completely rubbish at it rather than.
You're embarrassing. You go to the cinema and they show a teaching ad, and you're there going, "Don't do it."
Yes. Mind you, she taught in quite a tough school, which I think has now improved. I think it's a bit better, but I remember hearing one horror story where one Easter, the kids had all been taken to the local church for an Easter service, and the minister was a bit trendy, and the minister had decided to tell them about the horror of the crucifixion and how basically if you were crucified, your lungs collapsed and that was how you died and so on. And she said for weeks afterwards, they kept finding first years who'd been hung up on coat pegs to find out what would happen to them. That's very bad.
Kind of inspired though.
Yes, I suppose, yes, so that's sort of, scientific approach to research, just check what happens.
I'm going to guess that the answer to Patsy said, do you want her to send you the link to the post-mortem is probably going to be no.
That would be a very, very definite no. Thank you, Patsy. That's extremely kind, but no, thank you.
So one of my favourite questions to ask people is, what have you read recently that you've really enjoyed? Give us some book recommendations.
Oh dear, now you're asking. I'll have to look around for what I'm at. I have actually, this is awful. I have actually been reading Muriel Spark because for this next one, sorry, I'll be back. For this next one, I will tell you that it's set on a desert island. And she wrote a book called Robinson, which is set on a desert island. And obviously it's got allusions to Robinson Crusoe. As a result of which I reread Robinson Crusoe recently. I don't know if you can see this, but it's got a map on it. That doesn't look as if it's showing very well, but it's got a map on it, which is like a person sort of lying upside down. And that's the sort of key thing about it. But I reread Robinson Crusoe, and I would not recommend it to anybody. And I must have read it as a child. And I don't know whether I read a child's version, and this was me reading the real one, but it was the most boring book in the world. It's largely about him growing things. He's on this ruddy desert island for about 26 years, and he goes through all 26 years of him growing things. And the cannibals only turn up about halfway through. And then what I was really shocked by is towards the end, there's another character who has nothing to do with Robinson Crusoe, who's called Robinson. Now, I mean, that's just sloppy. I think we all know as writers that you run out of names and you end up calling people by the same name. But I mean, somebody like your editor or a proofreader is supposed to say, change this name. And obviously nobody did that with Daniel Defoe. But it's a ghastly book. And this again, Muriel Spark's books are actually quite short, which some people might think is a blessing. And this, as I say, I'm sort of riffing on this because there is a mysterious disappearance which could be a murder. So you could look on that book as a murder mystery. It's quite entertaining.
Sure, this came up earlier in conversation where we were discussing sort of classic books because one of the kids that I was teaching was reading Dracula. And enjoying it, but I'm not a fan of the book. And I think some kind of classics obviously donate an idea, which is great, but aren't always, when you go back and read them, don't always stand up to the test of time.
Yes. And it's disappointing sometimes when you read something that maybe when you were a teenager you thought was fantastic, and you go back to it and you think, what was it I saw in this? But one thing I'm getting quite evangelical about, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this out loud because it's not politically correct, but I don't like Charles Dickens. We used to read him at school, and I just found him very difficult and didn't enjoy the books. And I knew there was this other writer who was a mate of his called Wilkie Collins. And I decided because I didn't like Dickens, I wouldn't like Wilkie Collins. And I discovered Wilkie Collins a few years ago, and he's wonderful. He just writes the most brilliant books. They're really terrific. And he was also a very, very good guy. He's actually got one book. Helpfully, I can't remember which particular one it is, but at that point, there was no law against vivisection of animals. And he's got this book, which has got, all his books have got really, really good plots, and they're really pacey. But there's a sort of sub-theme about this man that is dissecting monkeys. And he's basically putting this in so that people will think dissecting monkeys is a very, very bad thing and we should stop it. So, but they're such good books, and also very funny at times, which I don't associate with Charles Dickens. I know he's got things that are supposed to be funny, but I don't find them funny.
I'm with you with the Charles Dickens.
Good, I'm glad. Yes.
There are things
by Wilkie Collins, he's great.
Yeah, but there are some fantastic classics. I love Dostoevsky as well. He's one of my favorite classical. Yes. And he has some comedies which people are.
And there are some of these things that you just think. That's right. I think people don't expect. I think people think that sort of, all Russian literature is sort of grim and ghastly and depressing and so on. It's not. Oh yes, I've got another hobby horse that I'm going to mention, because there were things that I said in the first one that I based on Tolstoy, and I've been rereading quite a lot of Tolstoy for writing the first book, and his descriptions of women's clothes are fantastic. He goes into incredible detail about what their clothes were like, and how is this possible? Any bloke they have no idea what you're wearing, and even if they vaguely knew, they wouldn't know how to describe it. Anyway, it turns out that Tolstoy would write a manuscript, but then when it was sent to his publisher, Mrs. Tolstoy made a fair copy of it. And it's my belief that Mrs. Tolstoy then put in all the descriptions of the women's clothes when she was doing the fair copy, because I don't believe that Mr. Tolstoy had the faintest idea.
I think you're probably right. Judging on the men I know, yeah, they wouldn't know.
No idea. No. So I think she should be given an authorial credit on the books posthumously.
Well, there's a lot of women back in the day didn't always get the acknowledgement that they deserved for things, did they?
So true, exactly. And you had the situation of the Brontes having to be published under male names, which is just horrendous now. Yet another hobby horse I'm going to come up with. You still have people who talk about Mrs. Gaskell instead of Elizabeth Gaskell, because they don't talk about Mr. Dickens. And I think it just sort of turns her into an appendage rather than making her a sort of full person.
I feel like Shona could go back in time and meet the Brontes. That might be a interesting clash of characters.
That would be good, but if Shona went back, they'd never die of consumption, because she'd have them, she'd know what they should be doing in order to improve their health, and so on. She'd get them out of the old mildewed rectory, and she'd have them yumping over the moors and so on. So Mind you, having said that, I think they did yomp over the moors, but they still succumbed to consumption. But I think Shona would sort things out. And she wouldn't have any truck with them having to have male names as authors. She'd go and have a word with the publishers.
She very definitely would.
I don't know if you've ever seen, yes, I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a wonderful cartoon that I think appeared in Punch. And it's this lady in a sort of crinoline frock and a bonnet, and she's sitting opposite a man at a desk. This is obviously in early 19th century. And it turns out that this is a publisher, and the publisher is saying, we love the plot, Miss Austen. All this effing and blinding will have to go. I'd like to imagine that as the first draft. You know?
Jane Austen, their classics that stood the test of time.
Yes, I think Jane Austen is brilliant. And I think, as you're saying, you know, we now look on these as classics, but at the time when she was writing, she was really breaking new ground with what she was doing and having these, you know, wonderful descriptions of people and their interactions and so on, and making women really interesting. Yeah. They're terrific books.
Absolutely terrific. What author events have you got? Because you do events in Edinburgh and things, don't you? Have you got any more events coming up?
Well, that's something I can recommend. I'm going to be chairing a writer called who some of you will know, called A.J. Close. This is, I think, on the 6th of February. It's next Tuesday, and she has written a brilliant book called, I think it's called What Doesn't Kill Us. And it's basically about the Yorkshire Ripper, except it's not the Yorkshire Ripper, it's set in Leeds. And it's a terrific book. She's got different female perspectives in it, including one who is a young female police constable. And you just realize, going back to, I think we're talking about the 70s, you know, how awful attitudes were. You know, I'm not saying we've necessarily improved that much, but I mean, they really were awful, and the sort of standard attitude towards women, including policemen towards policewomen, was just awful. But her book is great. And then I am going up on, I think it's the 23rd of February, I'm going to be at Granite Noir in Aberdeen. So that's fun. And nothing else on the cards at the moment, but I suspect, I hope some things will turn up.
It's interesting because I live in Leeds, and the Yorkshire Ripper thing, because some of his victims were from Leeds, is still very close to home for a lot of people. There was interestingly a fire raid, and Bradford wouldn't let people film at it, in it, the city, for it, because they were like, it's still too close.
That's really interesting. I think you'd love this book. I do heartily recommend it. Her name is AJ, spelled A-J-A-Y, Close, and it's really good. I think she herself is from Sheffield. I'm not sure, but I think she spent time in Leeds. And you know, it is really interesting, including what she has in her book is the same as what happened at the time, that when he was killing sex workers, it was not ignored, but it wasn't taken seriously. And then somebody was killed who wasn't a sex worker and was being referred to as an innocent victim, as if sex workers, you know, you could kill them with impunity, that didn't matter, so if they weren't women. But an innocent victim, you know, you got agitated about. And I think, you know, again, the attitudes behind that are really interesting. But it's a great book, and you know, some of it is very funny, despite the grim title, because it's, you know, it's based on characters, so it's people interacting with one another, and it can be very funny.
Remind us before we finish what people are going to be going off to buy. You can do both series.
Right. Well, this latest one is Miss Blaine's Prefect and the Gondola of Doom. But the first one is called Miss Blaine's Prefect and the Golden Samovar. The next one is called Miss Blaine's Prefect and the Vampire Menace. And the one just before this, which is set in Macbeth's time, is Miss Blaine's Prefect and the Weird Sisters. So that's all four. And as I say, there's a fifth one in the offing, which may include Strangulation by Bladerack.
Excellent. And your other series is under the name Helena Marchmont.
Helena Marchmont, and it's only available as ebooks. When I say ebooks, they're novellas. They're about 35,000 words, so they're about half the size of a normal novel.
And Patsy's given you an offer of coffee and bourbons in Rosyth.
Right. Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, Patsy has this superb book and blether club in Rosyth. And I was there recently, and she produced some bourbon biscuits, which was terrific.
Yeah. We'll finish with another bit of Patsy appreciation because she's fabulous.
She is a star. Absolutely, yes.
And then thank you so much for coming and joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm just absolutely delighted, and thank you for your great questions, and look forward to seeing you online.